The Conference for a New Constitution, held in 1953 and 54, acknowledged regional divisions. The new constitution did stick to a federal framework, but each region was to have its own government, assembly, and premier. If that political autonomy was striking, the region's economic powers would be even more so. Industry would now come under regional control. So would all customs and excise duties. Produce marketing boards would be regionalized. Even the civil service and the courts would be regional matters, as would education and health. The Lagos Conference, presided over by the Colonial Secretary, Oliver Littleton, was seen as a success in London. But critics said the Constitution went much too far down the path of regionalism. Inevitably, conflicts between national and regional issues would move to the core of Nigerian politics, especially for regional representatives at the center.
Of course, there has been a problem between us in the center and our counterparts in the region at that time, the ministers in the region and the ministers in the federal. The ministers at the regional level think that we are not sufficiently taking the interest of the North into consideration. Of course, we couldn't afford it. We were meant to serve the nation as a whole, and our main work was to integrate the entire Nigerian community into one.
The new constitution reflected divisions which the British had fostered, rifts which now led to personal rivalries and mistrust among politicians, and yet the colonial presence had always assumed a moral justification.
The British are not in Africa for Britain's sake alone, nor for Africa's sake alone. It is a complementary process. We are here to help Africans have a better standard of living, which in turn will help the British to have a better standard of living.
This now seemed hard to sustain.
The British served their interests much better than they served the interests of Nigerians. They would say that they were here to serve both interests. That's, if you doubt that like I do, then you cannot say that they made a mess, because they served the interests that they came here to protect.
In the 1954 elections, under the new constitution, the NPC and its allies again won the north, while the NCNC took the east, as widely expected. These elections confirmed the pattern of voting along regionalized party lines. In the west, the action group was to form the regional government, after NCNC legislators had crossed the floor to join them. By 1958, talks in London were preparing the way for independence within 2 years. Back in Nigeria, there was now a national government grouping all the major parties. The conference looked at the question of giving minorities a voice in the new Nigeria, but it decided not to create more regions or states. It was an issue that would return to haunt the politicians in the years to come. But these negotiators were to be key figures in Nigeria after independence. It was here that the Colonial Secretary, Lennox Boyd, announced the final date for independence, October the 1st, 1960. By now, no politicians wanted to be seen to delay the target date. The British were about to hand over, but their exploitation of Nigeria's resources, their disregard of its growth, their encouragement of divisions, these were all handicaps which Nigerians would now have to overcome. Despite the years of negotiation, Nigeria was ill-prepared for the handover. The British had marked the country. They'd promoted the values of traders and middlemen at the expense of native pride in agriculture. As a result, farming had been neglected. There had been little investment in its future. Farming was no longer seen as a desirable job by most Nigerians, and this would have serious consequences later. The much vaunted Nigerianization did indeed bring Africans into offices, but only as potential clerks for a colonial bureaucracy. To make the new institutions work for them, Nigerians needed expertise in politics, in social welfare, in the economy. They weren't given the chance to acquire it. Education had been geared to spreading European values. The European status had been based on practical expertise. They'd been in no hurry to pass it on to Africans. These inadequacies were to cast their shadow well into the future. Many of today's Nigerians have had to overcome the inheritance of those years.
I've had a particular interest in repairing things and being an engineer. And when I left school, my father sent me to work with the Royal Signals in my hometown at Abuah. But when my uncle heard that I was going to be an engineer, he advised me that if I became an engineer, the colonial powers did not like people in the colonies to be engineers, and that I will not have the opportunity of independent practice. I'll be made to work under strict supervision all the time. They believed that at that time that it was a very highly skilled profession, and maybe it would accelerate the move towards independence if we had many engineers who could do things for ourselves. We'd be more self-reliant and less dependent on engineers from Britain.
1959, the election campaign to choose Nigeria's first government after independence, a campaign that covered every area of the country. The elections would confirm previous trends, particularly the regional bases of the parties. The Northern People's Congress again won most seats in the Federal Assembly. It was to hammer out a coalition with the NCNC, leaving the Action Group back in opposition. Once again, the pattern of future politics was set. No single party had won a large enough majority to govern alone. With these elections, then, the first stage on the road to nationhood was complete, yet the legacy left by the British carried an unmistakable warning. The task of truly unifying the country was still ahead.
But one would have thought that the process of uniting this country should have started when they were here. But perhaps because of the policy which they had been identified with of divide and rule, they kept the different parts of the country separate for quite some time and left the country like this. This made it very difficult for the leaders, Nigerian leaders after independence, to bring about national unity so easily and so quickly.
Policies of divide and rule had served British interests, but now the British were leaving Nigerians to face the consequences.
And in fact, some of that legacy was in fact quite deleterious to immediate progress. Take, for instance, the increased separation of the North from the South, which is, for me, a deliberate act of, shall we say, colonial villainy, realizing that a very feudal North would be amenable to that sense of continuing power in some form or the other. In other words, the protection of that form of society, which for me is incompatible, is contradictory to, any kind of sense of democracy. But the British, it was in their interest to protect that feudalistic political structure.
Observers like Soyinka felt that the colonial legacy should be swept aside completely, that Nigeria should set out to create its own cultural identity.
For me, it was up to us to create whatever society we wanted, right from scratch. We talk about the legacy of the colonial masters. We'll only talk in terms of the physical structures, the introduction into the mainstream of European world, commerce, arts, technologies, and so on and so forth. I mean, those were undeniable legacies, and these one had to take for granted. But in terms of the cultural being of the nation, we felt this was something which had to be constructed all over again. The cause of the interruption which we'd had by this colonial legacy. Outside of that, I didn't really think much about the Europeans remaining part of our existence. I thought now we were really taking over.
A new age, the end of a century of foreign domination that Nigerians everywhere could welcome. The country had gained a constitution, a place in the community of nations. But the colonial power had created rifts in Nigerian society and exploited them for its own ends. That exploitation by the British would leave its mark for many years into the future. Today, 3 decades on, Nigeria is a concrete reality, a unified country. But at independence, the journey ahead was to be long. There'd be bitter lessons on the way. For in the years that followed 1960, the colonial legacy was to lead the newly born nation into instability and conflict.